DMs, GMs, gather round. I have something important to tell you. You're not using food enough in your TTRPGs. Let's talk about it. Fantasy role-playing games love taverns. One of the first major scenes in the animated adaptation of Season 1 of The Legend of Vox Machina is a tavern brawl. Punches are thrown, tables are flipped, food is flying, people are getting hit with chairs, and at the end of it all, they get kicked out in the street, and that's kind of what launches them into their quest. And taverns are so universal in fantasy that we almost stop noticing how weirdly standardized they are. Across thousands of fantasy worlds with different species, gods, climates, economies, and histories, everybody somehow kind of converges on the same basic menu: stew, chunk of cheese, crusty bread, ale, some roasted meat, perhaps, if the town is wealthy enough. The tavern just kind of is. And it's really just a loading screen where players wait for quests to just kind of be on their merry way. What I've been struggling with, what I've been thinking a lot about, is how food in TTRPGs is actually underutilized, because some of the most memorable moments in fantasy we have center completely around food. Every great story starts with a feast. From Lord of the Rings to Delicious in Dungeon, storytelling relies on food because it's immersive and relatable and universal. We rely on food to survive. We understand why the parents in Spirited Away feel drawn to the huge spread before them. They've been on a long trip and they're hungry. We have the same impulses. Fellowship of the Ring starts with a birthday party feast for a hobbit with one of the largest cakes we've ever seen. Harry Potter spends his first night in Hogwarts after a huge feast in the Great Hall after the Sorting Hat ceremony, and the entire point of that feast is to show how magical Hogwarts is. The food just appears on tables. Later on in the book series too, it serves as social commentary when Hermione starts getting outraged for the house elves on their behalf because of the conditions that they have to work in to produce that food. So when people think about world building, you're thinking about maps, you're thinking about pantheons, political factions, magic systems, and if you have a niche interest like military history, you're probably going to be thinking about, how warfare has changed over the millennia. But food is one of the oldest and most important technologies human societies have ever developed, because it determines whether you survive long enough to have culture in the first place. And so once you start looking at fantasy through that lens, a lot of settings start to feel really weird. So, let's talk about that. When I've run campaigns, I've run into an issue where my players, and this also has happened when I have been the player, I've run into this issue where I suddenly have all of this coinage to spend and nothing meaningful to spend it on. In 5e, and I'm going to be using 5th edition for the majority of my commentary. I understand that 5.5 exists and that there are other modules, but I feel like 5th edition is the most standardized, widely accepted version that is currently being used. So that's what we're going to be sticking with. In 5th edition, things are primarily broken down into coin. Coin is the primary way that value is determined. Everything collapses into coinage. Rewards, equipment, services, food, labor, but historically that hasn't always been the case. Currency, at least in the form of standardized minted coinage, is relatively recent in the longer history of human exchange systems. Prior to minted coinage, people used other things, naturally occurring items like shells, for currency and exchange, but I'm going to be talking about coinage specifically. The first widely recognized state-issued coins appeared in the Kingdom of Lydia in Western Anatolia in the 7th century BCE, roughly 2,700 years ago. But it took a minute before those were widely used to purchase goods, because a loaf of bread doesn't have nearly the same value as 1 gold coin. So we ran into some problems with that. Before that, though, societies relied on combinations of barter, tribute systems, labor obligations, weighed metals, livestock, grain, and just reciprocal exchanges that were more social than transactional. In subsistence economies specifically, food itself functioned as wealth because food ensured survival. If you think about a remote village, they may not have had access to gold, but they would have absolutely understood the value of preserved meats, grain stores, fresh milk, cheese, or bread in times of scarcity. So for much of human history, societies survived throughout movement. I'm oversimplifying here, but nomadic populations, especially pastoral nomads with livestock, moved through seasonal cycles following grazing lands and water sources to keep their livestock alive through harsher months. Their food systems were mobile by necessity, shaped by migration, climate, and ecological timing rather than permanent settlement, and we still see this in some pastoral nomadic groups today. And that often meant diets were inconsistent, seasonal, and heavily dependent on what the environment could support at any given moment. Preservation mattered, mobility mattered, knowledge of the land mattered, and the technologies developed to ensure preservation that mattered. So as more societies became, again, I'm oversimplifying here, but as more societies became increasingly agrarian and began settling permanently around fertile land, food production changed dramatically. Again, oversimplifying quite a bit, but generally speaking, the process goes this way. Agriculture creates surplus. Surplus supports population growth, immigration. Population growth brings in specialization. In the middle of all of this, you get some big shot who starts claiming to control the land around them, being worked, which leads us into hierarchy, taxation, and eventually states and imperialism. But it all comes down to food, because once food can be stored, it can be controlled, it can be redistributed at scale. Land itself stops just becoming territory and starts becoming an asset to be used, and infrastructure. And people fight over infrastructure. People fight over infrastructure. This is not some distant concept. This is happening in real time. And kingdoms rose and fell based off of their ability to secure farmland. Irrigation systems, grain stores, livestock routes, trade access. A bad harvest could destabilize an empire. In 1816, we had the year without a summer, which is where Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted. It's a volcano. Huge volcanic eruptions sent tons of ash and gases into the atmosphere, which cooled global temperatures by about half to, 3/4 of a degree Celsius to like a degree Fahrenheit. I apologize if the numbers aren't entirely correct. But what happened was, because of the global cooling, it impacted people's abilities to harvest food. Crops failed, and that led to civil unrest in France, in West Anglia. It wasn't good. It wasn't good. This is where TTRPGs, especially Dungeons and Dragons in particular, with its huge map of Faerun, can start to feel a little strange, because you have this massive map with all of these regions, with different climates, different cultures, different political histories, different planes of existence, and yet in tavern to tavern, city to city, from Waterdeep to Menzoberranzan, the food rarely changes in any meaningful way. It's always the same dark woody interior, a barkeep that doesn't ask too many questions, crusty bread, and ale. And that's not necessarily a bad trope. I'm not shaming it here. It's a classic for a reason that absolutely works. It's comforting, it's predictable, it's readable, it's easy to think about, and it immediately tells players that they're like what kind of story they're in, that they're safe, they can rest. I'm not trying to remove that at all. I'm just saying we could do more with it. Because imagine this instead. Your party is traveling north, increasingly harsh terrain, something closer to the journey we see in Faerun. They arrive at a small village that's struggling. A local leader asks for their help in dealing with a goblin horde that's been raiding livestock and stripping their food stores before winter sets in. There's a time crunch. They also don't have much gold. In fact, gold might be completely meaningless here, but what they do have are things like preserved foods, books, tools, livestock, or seasonal supplies. If your players have been living off of rations for weeks, fresh milk might be such a treat for them to have. The reward itself can tell you about the world you're living in. The reward itself can not only tell you about the world that your characters are living in, but it can relate really intense ideas like scarcity. Again, going back to Faerun, scarcity is constant. We see in season 2 what happens when their supplies run low. We hear the cracking of hardtack in their teeth as they're chewing, just sitting there, miserable. Finances as a scarcity are a repeating issue because Faerun likes to spend money on tomes. tomes being given as a reward so that she can learn new spells. These are mechanics you can bring into your games. The limitation of currency itself is a narrative tool because it forces characters and the audience to think in terms of need rather than want. Or you can look at Spice and Wolf, where trade itself is the story, the value of wheat, the manipulation of markets, the logistics of moving goods between regions, black markets, secret trade routes. It all becomes dramatic because the food and the trade aren't background systems, they are the engine. They are the plot device that drives the narrative forward. Apples or grain are fine, but they become interesting when it's tied to survival, speculation, and power. It's not just about being paid in food, it's about what food is offered in the first place, because food changes dramatically based on where you are in the world. And that's something that I feel like TTRPGs flatten without meaning to, not in like a malicious way, but everyone gets the same rations regardless of species, climates, or culture. I often find myself wondering why a human, a tabaxi, a halfling, a tiefling, an orc, an elf, a githyanki, or a drow would all be eating the exact same standardized travel pack. Why? Especially when some of these species come from environments or cultural contexts that are different to one another. Tabaxi and are based off of cats. Cats are obligate carnivores. Like, what does that look like for a tabaxi? And this brings up really interesting questions too. Like, what happens when a drow runs out of their rations they had procured underground while they're on the surface? What does that look like in play? What are the cultural or ethical implications for something like a Dampier in the party, where their dietary needs are fundamentally different from the rest of the group? Where do they source food? Who in the party is responsible for that? Or do we just quietly ignore it because it's inconvenient mechanically? Now, I'm not saying to suggest that we need to bring D&D and turn it back to the Dark Ages and, turn D&D into some hyper-realistic survival simulation, or bring back something like early edition bookkeeping where every calorie counts and you have to, take cooking as a skill to make sure that you don't die. That's not the point. That's not what I'm trying to get at. That's what I'm saying here. The point I'm trying to make is that there's a really interesting layer of immersion available here if you want it, when you start thinking about food as culture rather than just a resource. Even something as simple as halflings, I think, shows this really clearly. They're based off of Tolkien's Hobbits, for those who aren't aware that that's what they're based off of. And hobbits have this incredibly specific cultural relationship with food. Repeat it with me. Breakfast, second breakfast, 11 C's, luncheon, afternoon tea, supper, dinner, or dinner, supper. Either way, food isn't just sustenance for them, it structures their entire day. We see that in Lord of the Rings when Merry and Pippin are, thinking, well, what about second breakfast?
Gentlemen, we do not stop till nightfall.
What about breakfast?
We've already had it.
We've had one, yes. What about second breakfast?
Don't think he knows about second breakfast, Pip.
What about 11sies? Luncheon, afternoon tea, dinner, supper. He knows about them, doesn't he?
I wouldn't count on it.
Like, that's something to them that they don't think twice about, but the Aragorns were like, what? What are you talking about? Like, no, we're not stopping for second breakfast. Like, no. You could absolutely bring something like that into your campaign, and suddenly hunger no longer just a survival mechanic, it's the rhythm of how your players structure their day. Now, that's not to say that, again, you should take cooking as a skill or turn every session into a food management simulator. I'm not trying to push things back into very crunch-heavy survival rule sets, because again, I am talking 5th edition here. I'm just saying, if you want your world to feel more lived in, there's a lot of design space here and a lot of potential that's going really untouched. And then you start moving into regional cuisine, it becomes even clearer how much food is shaped by your environment. Climate directly affects agriculture and what can be grown. Climate also affects preservation methods. Preservation methods affect what people can carry, trade, and survive on. Hi, Editor Hillary here. I realized that when I was putting this together that my mind was bouncing around a little bit too much and the transition back wasn't the clearest. Again, we're going back to talking about the geographical variety of Faerun. So we're going to tie this into some real world examples. It's just to give you kind of like a baseline idea of how you can vary cuisine from location to location. I mean, for example, indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest, including the Tlingit, Haida, and Coast Salish, have developed sophisticated methods of smoking and drying salmon to preserve seasonal abundance of the salmon runs. When you live in an environment where food arrives in massive seasonal outbursts, the challenge itself isn't harvesting it, it's making it last for the rest of the year. You also see similar preservation logic in coastal Scandinavia, where smoked fish traditions go back centuries. A different environment, same fundamental problem. How do you turn a short window of abundance into something that can sustain you through scarcity? In the Andes, you have something like chuño, freeze-dried potatoes produced by leaving crops out at extremely high altitudes, where nighttime freezing and daytime thawing very slowly dehydrate them. This is one of those things that sounds like fantasy alchemy until you realize it's just people using their environment cycles as preservation tools. If we're gonna get into this further, which we're gonna, because this is one of the things I'm really passionate about, you move into arid regions like the Sahara, the Sahel, the Gobi, where drying becomes one of the most default logics of food storage. You got meat, grain, millet, sorghum, all of it adapted to the fact that water is scarce and evaporation is constant. The environment itself is doing the work for you. In the Middle East and North Africa, we see this with dried fruits for dates, figs, apricots, things that naturally lend themselves to long-term storage and long-distance trade, which means we're no longer seeing food just supporting survival. We're starting to see how it impacts economies. In the Mediterranean too, olives are preserved in brine or oil and become a foundational long-distance trade food along with preserved fish. And we see this through the historical record. This is not something that's new. This has been done forever. So once you start thinking about it in those terms, it raises an interesting question for TTRPGs, because if we look at the map of Faerun, there are different environments that could produce entirely different food systems. Why? Why do fantasy settings why does D&D treat food as completely interchangeable from region to region? Why does every tavern serve the same stew, whether you're in the very north in the Rime of the Ice Maiden, or in, Waterdeep, or in the Desert City, or in Menzoberranzan? Why is everything the same? Magical subscription boxes that deliver fresh ingredients to your door, they don't exist in Faerun. They don't exist in Faerun. So once you start looking at food systems this way, preservation, trade, regional cuisine, seasonal survival, you start noticing something else underneath it, because food isn't just culture, it's power. And this is also one of the most underutilized aspects of food in TTRPGs, the power of it all. Luxury foods are an extremely clear example of this. Over time, ingredients just stopped being ingredients and became commodities. They're luxury goods, things that were sought after, that were moved across regions, across oceans, that shaped entire political systems. A couple of them that are worth noting: sugar, tea, coffee, spices, cocoa. These aren't just flavor systems in world history. They became entire trade networks that shaped oppressive labor systems, colonial expansion, taxation, naval power, migration patterns that we still see the impacts of to this day. One of the reasons that fair trade is something that I try and purchase fair trade of all of these things, because the systems, the oppressive systems to harvest these items still exist. People live in horrific conditions picking tea, coffee, sugar, cocoa, spices for our enjoyment. And that still exists today. I think sometimes we think of these things as being relics of the past, but no, they're still omnipresent. Like, they're everywhere. And then you can tie this into scarcity, because food, once it becomes limited, it no longer just becomes about culture or preferences. It turns into control. The Irish potato famine is a horrifically fantastic example about this. I think that's really the only way I can say it. It's a historical tragedy. It absolutely is, but I think it ties into how ecosystems and power go hand in hand with food scarcity. So what happened, basically, cliff notes, really, really long story short, a fungus was introduced from North America into Ireland, and it thrived in the cool, moist environment, and it totally destroyed like half of the Irish potato crop, which was like the main thing that the Irish people relied on to survive at the time. And I mean, that itself is devastating enough, but what happened after, the British government refused to administer aid. They pinned it as a moral failure on the Irish. It really, really nasty. Just, I mean, there is infrastructure that still exists. There are walls that run through counties that were built in Catholic communities as part of famine relief work projects to try and provide work and income for unemployed peasants because nothing would grow. You look at siege warfare. The siege of Constantinople, it took 53 days for their grain supplies to be totally depleted. There's also sieges like the siege of Tikal in the Maya civilization, where something similar happened. Cutting off food supply, more effective and easier than direct military confrontation because you don't need to risk your army to defeat another army if you can just make it impossible for the opposing forces to eat. And we see this in modern contexts. We see this very clearly in modern contexts. In Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine, Cuba, we see how supply access becomes a tool of pressure and control. Blockades, sanctions, restricted supply chains in different geopolitical contexts, because there's a very uncomfortable truth about the heart of it. Whoever controls food doesn't just control survival, they control movement. They control loyalty. They control how long a population can continue to exist in a given place. And so if you bring this level back into your TTRPGs, especially 5th edition, it starts to reframe how we think about entire regions and conflicts, because wars and conflicts in D&D, they're no longer just about territories or ideologies. It's about supply lines. It's about harvests. It's about whether a city can feed itself through the winter, whether it can depend on trade routes that can be cut off. So something simple like a goblin raid on a city, it stops being a random encounter and starts becoming a direct attack on a region's ability to survive, which incidentally would make goblins far more disruptive and meaningful than most fantasy TTRPGs would seem to acknowledge. If we look at Horde of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat, one of my favorite modules, how would the cult of Tiamat work while they're trying to build power? It's easy of them to think is just purely dragon cult that wants power, but you miss really interesting potential because they're not only raiding caravans for treasure, because the group is swelling in size. Why aren't they raiding for grain and livestock? Are they targeting granaries instead of castles? Because if you think about it, burning a granary does far more long-term damage than winning a single battle. Are they embedding themselves in trade routes like or control agricultural reasons through fear, bribery, or protection schemes? We look at the faction agent background in Dungeons and Dragons, and the Henterim come to mind. Underground network, smuggling goods. We're not using that enough. I mean, this just not only impacts the quest itself, but it's also the people who hand out the quests to your players, because the monster problem in a region is no longer just abstract. It's not just goblins in a cave or trolls in the mountains. Quests are actively about stopping something that is limiting a region's ability to survive. And this really reframes what the players are doing, because they're not just clearing enemies to level up, they're stabilizing an entire region based off of a crop that's holding in a settlement together. I mean, something as simple as escorting a food caravan, or just a caravan in general, on paper. In the book, that sounds like a simple protection detail, get paid a couple coins. But in practice, you're talking about moving the difference between survival and famine across contested territory, because the caravan might not even be valuable in gold terms. Maybe it's grain, maybe it's apples, maybe it's barrels of pickles, who knows? But whatever it is, maybe it's heading to a city that cannot survive the winter without it. Which means that every single delay, every attack, every broken wagon wheel isn't just an inconvenience. People die. And this is actually one of the things I really like about the Icewind Dale Rime of the Frost Maiden. I'm going to keep this very light on spoilers, but the entire region is locked in an unending winter. The sun isn't behaving normally, and the seasons are broken. The result is something that I feel like D&D very rarely commits to in a systemic way, which is food becoming the central pressure of an entire setting. And you feel it immediately, not in an abstract survival rules exist kind of way, but in the way that villages behave, because supplies are so scarce. Trade is so strained. Tensions are high. Hunting becomes dangerous. Even basic travel, you have to weigh whether you can afford to eat, to stay warm on the way back. And I think that module, I think what it does really well here is it shows you how scarcity doesn't just affect mechanics, it reshapes behavior. Because in Rime of the Frost Maiden, villages make decisions that they normally wouldn't. Morality becomes negotiable in ways it wasn't before. You see people making decisions that you think to yourself, oh, would I ever do this? And you go, immediately, no. But once you're in that position, once you see the characters in that position, you start to go, oh, I can see why you made this decision. Cooperation, desperation, the lines between the two blur together completely. And then on top of that, you see how this scarcity, how this environmental shift bleeds into ritual and belief, how people are interpreting the winter, how they're explaining it, how they're adapting their worship, their stories, their expectation of the world around them. Food shortage becomes not just an economic problem, but it reshapes the entire region, entire culture itself, which is the point that I'm trying to keep coming back to here, which is when food becomes unstable, food is kind of like the bottom of the pyramid. When that becomes unstable, everything else becomes unstable too. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, food becomes something far more unsettling in the Curse of Strahd, because food scarcity isn't environmental, it's predatory. And again, trying to, limit spoilers here for those who haven't run the Curse of Strahd. Count Strahd von Zarovich is a vampire, and vampires feed on blood. That's just kind of what it is. So when you zoom out and realize he effectively controls an entire region, what you're looking at is basically a kill pen system of predation, where there's a set area and he has all of his food going around the inside. It's a contained ecosystem of terror where a predator is constantly after you. And that changes the pressure on players in a very interesting way, because it's not just, is there enough food in the village? It's, who is the food that exists for? What does it mean to live inside a place where you are part of someone else's survival cycle? And this leads to this constant background tension where land isn't neutral, it's owned in a very real biological sense, and there is a clock and it is ticking. And interestingly, this idea also shows up in a different way in Magic the Gathering. One of my favorite characters in that setting is Avacyn, and I feel like I'm tattling on myself a lot here because I'm absolutely biased. I'm a cleric main in basically every game I touch. There is something about being able to fix people and make things better, and also a really strong lady with a spear enforcing order on chaos that tickles a very specific part of my brain, but narratively she exists for a very specific reason. Soren Markov created her because the vampire system in Innistrad was beginning to over-harvest humanity to the point where it threatened collapse, not just morally, but ecologically. Because if the vampires consume too much, there wouldn't be enough humans left to sustain the population, to sustain the system that keeps the vampires alive. So Avacyn isn't just like a holy antagonist to vampires in a simple good versus evil sense. She is a correction. She's a fail-safe mechanism, a way of stabilizing an ecosystem that had started to consume its own base layer. So whether it's fantasy horror or card game mythology, the same pattern keeps showing up, where food systems become unbalanced, the world doesn't just become dangerous, it starts to regulate itself in extremely crazy ways. Once you start seeing food as something that shapes systems like this, there's just a couple other layers that become impossible to ignore, because it doesn't just build worlds, it fuels people. Food fuels people. At the heart of every TTRPG, whether it's futuristic tech, grim survival campaign, or classic high fantasy, what matters most is the journey. We tell ourselves that it's not about the destination, it's about the journey, and that's true. Where carefully crafted characters rise up in the face of adversity and grow to accomplish the near impossible, hoping to become stronger and better than they were at the beginning. Sometimes your party devolves into a bunch of murder hobos, but that's, a conversation for another time. But regardless of that, people are the heart of the table. Which brings us back to the most overused and under-examined space in all of TTRPGs, the Tavern. They show up everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're in a high fantasy capital or a frozen northern village or in a tech city or a desert trade city or a haunted crossroads that definitely hasn't had a health inspector come by and shouldn't have a functioning business license. It is a massive tetanus risk. There's always a tavern somewhere, and they basically look the same. And don't get me wrong, it works. And there's a reason that works, because taverns are readable. They are predictable. They are familiar. You can slot them in anywhere. It's an immediate signal to players that says you're safe enough to stop moving. We'll resume later. But the problem is I feel like we've accidentally treated the tavern as a universal cultural construct, as if every society and every environment independently came to the same conclusion and converged on the same architectural solution for eating, drinking, socializing, negotiating contracts, delivering quest hooks. Because when you zoom out a bit, that feels really strange, because that's not how it is in reality. Human beings have never agreed on how food is supposed to work socially. Some of us eat standing up. Some of us eat sitting down. Some of us eat on floors, at tables, upright, reclining, in silence, in ceremony, in public squares, in private homes, from shared bowls, individual portions, and rituals, in haste, in grief, in celebration. We eat differently. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons why seeing Denethor eat in a grief-stricken frenzy is so unnerving. Food is one of the most variable social systems we have. So the question becomes, why? Why does fantasy so often collapse all of this into a single room with a bar in it, when food is one of the strongest forms of social communication we have? Why have we limited ourselves this way? Who gets fed first matters. Who prepares the food matters. How it's prepared matters. Who is allowed to refuse food? That matters, because in many cultures, accepting food isn't just being polite. You are entering into a relationship with that person, even if it's only temporary, is an establishment of trust. And this isn't just theoretical. This is a very real concept in a couple of extremely old traditions. In many Middle Eastern and Bedouin traditions, hospitality is a moral obligation. Feeding and sheltering a guest is part of a deeply ingrained ethical code. There's also the concept of the golden rule, where you treat others the way you want to be treated. And then there's the ancient Greek concept of Xenia. The term Xenia comes from the Greek word xenos, meaning stranger or guest. In ancient Greek culture, Xenia referred to the sacred bond between host and guest, characterized by mutual respect and hospitality. This practice was not just a social norm, it was divine obligation that the gods themselves commanded and acted as guardians of. So the moral and ethical implications of Xenia were profound. It established a code of conduct that mandated generosity and protection for travelers and strangers, which ensured that no one would be left vulnerable or alone. And the reciprocal nature of Xenia had responsibilities for both guests and hosts. So on the host's part, you were expected to provide food, shelter, and safety to your guests. On the guest's part, you were expected to show gratitude, be respectful of the host's property, and not overstay your welcome. And when that was violated, that was a crime against the gods themselves. And we actually see this play out in a few ways in the Odyssey. Now, maybe you can keep this in mind when you go see the Odyssey in theaters later this year. I think it's this year, or is it next year? I can't remember. First example is Penelope. We see Penelope holding down the fort at home. Odysseus hasn't been home in a very, very long time. Suitors are starting to show up because they think Odysseus is dead and that Penelope needs to remarry. And so suitors are starting to just drive her up the wall. They will not leave. But despite it all, she remains a figure of grace and dignity. And there's definitely a conversation to be had here about the gender expectations of grace, dignity, and hospitality, but that's not necessarily relevant to the conversation at this time. But I mean, this definitely it's worth noting. Okay. And then, and so there's this, these people are taking advantage of her, but she's doing her absolute best to uphold Xenia. If she were, if it didn't exist, she would have kicked him out forever ago. And then when Odysseus returns, he exacts insane revenge on the men who took advantage of his wife's generosity. And the gods allow it. Polyphemus, the Cyclops, this is the opposite situation. So Odysseus and his men arrive on the island. Instead of Polyphemus offering them hospitality, he captures them and threatens to eat them. And this leads to dire consequences for Polyphemus, with Poseidon himself punishing the Cyclops. A quick point of clarification here. Poseidon did in fact send a storm to punish the Cyclops for breaking Xenia, but he also punished Odysseus with that same storm, so it was kind of like a two birds, one stone situation. So yes, Poseidon was upset at the Cyclops. He was also upset at Odysseus for blinding, his son, but it started with Xenia. Okay, it started with Xenia. This concept, I feel, is one of the things that D&D needs more of, because in Dungeons & Dragons, the gods aren't just an abstract concept, they exist. Clerics, warlocks, paladins and their oaths, curses, all of them are evidence that divine power exists in some way, that the gods are still there, even at least theoretically. So why do the gods not enforce hospitality in Dungeons & Dragons the way that they do in, other mythology? Why do the gods not enforce hospitality as a social expectation? Because in practice, adventurers can just waltz into a tavern or another establishment, start a fight, burn it to the ground, loot it, leave, harass the maid who works there, and yet the world continues on around it, but should it? And why does that work? Why do adventurers get to violate a sacred responsibility and face no real-world cosmic consequences for it, especially when we have an existing alignment system? And I think part of that answer is that TTRPGs intentionally decouple morality from automatic divine enforcement. The gods in 5e are present, but they're not constantly intervening. They don't function as active regulators of hospitality or food systems or social contracts in the way that older mythology sometimes did. Instead, enforcement kind of gets pushed downwards into law, reputation, alignment, sometimes if you are one of the DMs who, if enforces people's alignments, or a DM discretion, which sometimes that means something really subtle happens where food stops being protected by cosmic structure and is just another interactable object in the world. Taverns are no longer a sacred hospitality space, they're just a set piece, a lootable environment, a quest hub, sometimes just a slot-in throwaway battlefield, and I think that's a shame. I think that's a shame, and I think that's exactly why a lot of taverns and TTRPGs feel so interchangeable, because hospitality, once it stops being enforced socially, culturally, or divinely, it stops being meaningful, and breaking hospitality, it stops being meaningful, because in real life there were implications that if you broke hospitality it would anger the gods, but in our games all it does is the DM kind of just resigns and goes, roll for initiative. The last point I kind of want to get into here is that food doesn't just change worlds, it changes the people in them, because yes, your players are going to remember the BBEG at the very end. They're going to remember the final fight, the big twist. They're going to remember the nat 20s. They're going to remember the nat 1s. They're going to remember the way the campaign resolves, but they also remember the people along the way. Those beloved NPCs that really bother you. The ones that they're like, and what is this barkeep named? And you have to go, his name is Jeremy. You have to improvise at the last second. Those beloved NPCs that show up in between all that chaos. Some of my favorite memories of playing D&D with my friends have been nothing to do with the main plot at all. The little kobold. There was a kobold that we almost pushed off of a ledge. Well, no, not almost. He actually pushed off of a ledge, was falling directly into the Underdark, and then we immediately derailed the entire session because we were calculating the physics and debating we were calculating if kobolds have terminal velocity, and then we were debating if the physics of a druid in wild shape dive bombing to go catch said kobold would be doable. Ultimately, we came to the conclusion that yes, we could go save the kobold, but that took like 30 minutes to debate, right? There's also Merlin the Wizard, which is a recurring character in the games my spouse runs, where he has a shop full of magical curiosities, and it never looks the same way when you enter it twice. Or there's also that barkeep who somehow becomes the party's unofficial therapist despite not having the qualifications to do so, or that goblin child that the party collectively decided to adopt without consulting any child services whatsoever, and now the DM has to be very careful about what happens to that goblin child because that will derail the entire campaign. These are the things that people remember the most. This is one of the things that we're not using as much to our advantage, because in campaigns, death ends a character's story. That beloved NPC is left behind in the dust. But in many real-world cultures, death begins a different kind of ongoing interaction, often maintained through food and ritual. In your campaigns, graves shouldn't just be graves. They can also be places where food systems and practices exist, a complex balance between survival and ritual, prioritizing the real needs of the living with the same very real needs of the deceased. In ancient Egypt, burial practices often meant including food and drink offerings, sustenance for the journey or continuation of existence in the afterlife. Death wasn't an ending of material needs, it was a continuation of them. In traditions like Dia de los Muertos, food isn't just a symbolic remembrance. There are specific items that are placed for the dead. There are favorite items that are made, carefully, lovingly prepared and placed as if the dead are still there in the household, as if they're expected to return and participate in the world of the living. And in traditions across East Asia, including parts of Japan and China, food offerings at graves and household altars maintain an ongoing relationship with ancestors. Not metaphorically, literally, relationally. And this is, I think, another thing where tabletop role-playing games quietly diverge from a lot of these other older cultural logics, because in campaigns, death is final. It ends your character's story. But I think there's potential there. There's potential for it to continue, because if you start thinking about food as a world-building infrastructure, even something as simple as a grave stops being a place where stories end. It becomes a way for stories to continue, where memory, obligation, survival, they all overlap just in a different form. And I think if I had one piece of advice for DMs and GMs out there, it's remember this. The stories you create, the world you create, the stories that exist within it, the relationships, all of the effort, if it doesn't understand how it eats, it forgets how it lives. You just need to incorporate more food into your games. So that brings us to the end of the episode. If you liked what you saw, smash that like button. I would love to hear your thoughts. I have a list of sources if you want to check them out down below. I will put those in the description. But yeah, like the video if you liked the video. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. Ring the bell for notifications. You're the first to know when new videos go live. We're going to get back to our regular content next week. This has just been something that's been like ringing around in my brain at 10,000 decibels, and I have to do it, otherwise I'm gonna go crazy. And so we're taking a little we're diverging a little bit from our regular content here. We'll get back into making more delicious food next week. But yeah, I think that's about it. Like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, share this video with someone. Yeah, let's talk about this in the comments below. I read every comment. I try and respond to every comment, so leave that down below. And adventurers, as always, take care of yourselves. Do something nice for someone else, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye. Hi, cutie patootie. Look how cute you are. Yeah. I'm sorry, am I being too loud? Umpire, what's up? He's mad at me because I'm interrupting his nap. Granted, he has the ability to nap wherever he wants, but oh my gosh, my face itches. I mean, ecosystem where the predator entirely controls